Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Ralston College podcast. Today, we're going to ask a really pressing and fundamental question about the whole possibility of education, and that is education without indoctrination even possible? I'm going to be joined in this conversation by two wonderful interlocutors. Dr. David Butterfield is a classicist at the University of Cambridge who has written powerfully and beautifully and even plaintively about what's happening in the universities. He said the courage to speak up and ask the question of whether great universities are failing in their key objective, which is to pursue the truth. In fact, he's recently resigned his position at the University of Cambridge in order to be able to speak freely and fight for the humanities and what they stand for as independently as he can. The second is Dr. John Vervaeke, who's no doubt known to many of you, the professor of cognitive science at the University of Toronto, who's had such a powerful contribution to the whole meaning crisis and the role that education plays in the broadest sense, both in a scholarly way, but also in the broad sense of self-education, of enlightening and liberating ourselves from and into our very selves on his podcast, In the Classroom and Far Beyond. We recorded this conversation in New York when many of us were attending the Dissident Dialogues Conference, which was a gathering of people who were seeking to ask big questions in respectful and serious and deep and indeed curious ways. It was a lively discussion between the three of us, first with me and David, and then John joins us, and of course that leads to a pretty lively Q&A as well. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Till next time. We thought at Ralston College, given that we had kind of a posse of people at this wonderful event, that it would be nice to have a gathering and to celebrate the relaunch of the Ralston College podcast, which has had a good and lively and kind of global history, but went on hiatus for the first year of the college's operations, and we were very focused on our students in Savannah. Anyway, it's recently relaunched, and it's a great pleasure to have you all here today. We thought what would be fun was to have a conversation inspired by an advertisement that we put out into the world for this admissions cycle. It's appeared in the New Criterion, amongst other places, and it makes the claim, education without indoctrination. And today, David and I, with all of you, are going to ask the question, is that possible? Can it exist? And David and I will kick things off with a few reflections about the current state of play of education, of higher education, you might say of the indoctrinating character that seems to be sadly very widespread in the academy and beyond, and then ask what it would look like if indeed an alternative to that is possible. So with that said, David, how would you characterize I should first say this is David Butterfield, the esteemed classicist at the University of Cambridge. He'll tell you perhaps a bit more about himself. But let's start things off. We are always at Ralston College very careful not to be defensive or reactionary, but to have positive commitments. It is nonetheless often helpful to have a sense of, what is the landscape that we are looking to make a positive intervention in the middle of. So David and I will kick things off, and then we'll welcome all of you to join, make comments, ask questions, and so on, and have John Vervaeke come up and join us in a few minutes. And there are little microphones. If you do make an intervention, just make sure you have a mic and you hold it in your hand so we can carry that onto the recording. David.
Well, thank you, Stephen. It's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I suppose the best place to begin when posing the question of whether or not education without indoctrination is possible is to define that very term, indoctrination. Because on paper, it looks like a pretty good word. Doctrina is learning, and putting learning into someone seems to be the process of education. It would be absurd to object to that. But of course, when we use that word, we mean something much more politically charged and in almost every context, negatively charged. And so what do we mean by indoctrination? To define the term from my perspective, I mean putting a particular spin, be it political, be it ideological, onto the frame of the education you are meant to be delivering. But it's more than putting a spin on it. it's being uncritical and implicit in how that spin is placed upon it. So to be clear, I am based at Cambridge, but for reasons we may go into, I've decided to leave a permanent position in the classics at Cambridge. I'm perfectly comfortable with the possibility that a given academic has strongly held political or ideological positions. That is what it is to live in the world. But the problem arises once a given academic cannot distinguish between those personally held political and ideological positions and the duty of instructing critically whatever students come before that person. So, to go further, I'm perfectly content with someone within a lecture course stepping before the audience and saying, I personally, having weighed up the evidence before me, have come to form this view about the world or this view about the evidence, so long as two things happen when that is done. Number one, it's explicitly ring-fenced that this is a personal view of the academic, which they're sharing with the audience, perhaps to inspire and encourage them, or perhaps to open it up for criticism. But they've got to be honest about the fact that this is a personally held reflection on the material. Secondly, that person needs to make all efforts to argue critically about the other valid ways of approaching that material. In fact, they've got to steel man, that is to say, make the strongest case about the political and ideological positions that they don't personally hold. So long as those two things happen, indoctrination is not possible, because there's been an openness, a freedom of inquiry in the educational journey, which means someone is not witlessly or unwittingly led down a path to a particular position which is not open to criticism. So that's what I mean by education with indoctrination, and the question that we're going to explore with you is whether any educational institution can indeed avoid the danger of indoctrination.
Thank you, David. Well, before we turn to the positive, delineating a positive vision, let me ask you your take on what the general state of play in higher education is, because I think we all know that though there are many pockets of strength and good faith arguments and serious and highly intelligent and thoughtful professors and teachers, that there is nonetheless an atmosphere of indoctrination at many, if not most, but very many, maybe most universities. And one of the marks of that is that you can predict, I noticed this about a decade ago, you could predict with a high degree of accuracy the views that many undergraduates, if not most undergraduates, would come out of their higher educational institutions with. You can predict those. It was kind of, you can help me here, but roughly speaking, skepticism, if not antagonism towards the idea of free markets, towards Western civilization, towards men, or what might call the patriarchy, towards the southern aspects of the United States, towards, and so on and so forth. You can just gather these, I think we all are familiar with this position. And this is a mark of a highly ideological environment, that it produces that kind of conformity of opinion. There you are at Cambridge, which is, I think, still one of the great universities in the world, and nonetheless, even there and elsewhere. How do you characterize what you see on the inside of the universities insofar as it is trending towards an indoctrinating character in the wrong or bad sense?
I think in terms of educational and intellectual practice, several universities in the social sciences and the humanities have entered a phase which could be called indoctrination in the way I set out. And in other places, there's a softer version of that, whereby a monoculture, an orthodoxy of acceptable opinion and acceptable approaches has created an environment of self-censorship. So the brightest people at all of the institutions we're talking about, I don't think necessarily come to share the package of ideas you set out, Stephen, but more devastatingly, they are not able to flex their intellectual muscles and to spread their wings within these cultures, because the social as well as potentially the intellectual penalty for not following that orthodoxy is very great. So just to flesh that out briefly, if you have any institution that has a strong political bias in one direction, and teaches in a way that political approach is self-evidently right, very quickly you have a culture where seminar discussions, assignments set for you, and indeed examinations work with a closed-minded approach to what the correct outcome is. And even the free-thinking individuals in the classroom don't have the space to explore those ideas and to challenge them in person. And so the very heterodoxy of what an intellectual space like a university is meant to be very quickly disappears, and the result is either soft or harder indoctrination. And I'm sorry to say that in the social sciences and the humanities, the great majority of American institutions do not allow the freedom of inquiry, which is utterly essential to being a university. In Britain, there are problems, but I think we're slightly upstream of where things are heading, but unless things change, we will end up in a very similar position too.
Well, let's transition here. I think that it needs to be said that the basic premise of education as indoctrination is that there could only ever be indoctrination. And I see this to come out of a kind of Neo-Marxist standpoint in which there is no truth but only power, right? And so it's a kind of cynical worldview. Nietzsche, you all are perhaps familiar with this idea of the will to power, right? That's a kind of cardinal explanation of everything. And so that in any interaction, there can only ever really be power that is animating it. And so what that leads to is the idea that, every interaction is fundamentally a matter of dominance and not about truth. It's about manipulation of one person over another. And so that by this reading, even what we might call fair-minded inquiry or the pursuit of truth or objectivity or dialogue, those are all just shams. They're all just covers for what's really going on underneath of it, which is a dominating effort of one over another, because these higher-minded ideals don't really exist. They're not realities. They're just constructs that we bring in to cover for what's actually, if you uncovered, a naked will to power. And so, if that worldview, we can put it that way, is true, there is no such thing as education that is not indoctrination. There's no such thing as truth. They're fundamentally, as David was saying earlier today, from that perspective, the university is impossible, right? Because the university is committed to the discovery of truth as independent of power or position or prestige. The truth is no one's possession, and yet everyone's possession. And so the question that we want to drive to and to invite all of you to participate in is, what does education look like that is not indoctrinating? And I want to invite all of us to think about this at various levels. But one way into this, I think, is actually very personal. We all in our lives have experiences of conversations and settings, whether as parents or children, whether as friends or students or teachers or any other of the many, might say, roles that each of us inhabits, have experience of conversations that have gone really, really badly because they were coerced, they collapsed in rancor or failure, they felt obligated or undermined from the start, they didn't have good faith in them. Well, we've also all had conversations or experiences of dialogue over time that went somewhere, that were free and illuminating and opened up the world for us and were non-coercive. And I, in a way, what I want to think about here is, what are the conditions of the conversations that are in the latter category? Because certainly at Ralston College, we're unabashed about the fact that we have 4 fundamental commitments: to the pursuit of truth, to the freedom on which that pursuit depends, freedom of inquiry, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of conscience, to the apprehension and appreciation of beauty, and to the fellowship or friendship that is both the context in which we can pursue these high things, but also the result of that pursuit. We become friends with those we seek the truth together with. And so, anything that you build, any institution, any organization, any relationship, it always has to be relative to a purpose, a telos, an end. And if that telos is seeking the truth, then you say, well, what is the environment that facilitates or doing that? How do we set things up that happens? How do we set things up that the character of the college is like the character of those conversations we've had? That you think, wow, that opened my world up, that made me stronger, clearer-minded, closer to the people I'm seeking this with, and so on. So, David, I'd invite you to share your thoughts as a teacher on what are the basic conditions for an environment that fosters the wholehearted pursuit of truth.
Well, certainly, as you say, if someone has reached the depressing position that they are cynical, skeptical, nihilistic about the idea that knowledge and truth exist outside the individual and are simply competing ideological ways of battling for power and grappling in the world for dominance, then that is antithetical to the university. Because it's true at the deep level that the university, as we understand it, is a sort of small p political project. Why? Because it believes in the notion of tradition, traditio, the handing over of what is deemed worthy of handing over. And that has judgment within it. It has a sense of a hierarchy of values as to what has been done well and what has not been done well in the scholarly world, of what is true and helpful and what is false and obstructive. So the people who chant on everything is political could indeed make the claim that the university, as we're talking about it is political in a way. But I think not in an interesting way, because we all have the decision as to what is worthy of handing over, and any student has the choice, they should have the choice, as to whether they want to receive it or reject it. That is open inquiry, and that is freedom of intellectual exploration. So the conditions should be a confidence in the purposes of the university, and it is a plural set of purposes. It's partly to unify people with the society in which they are in, to understand how we have got where we have got and why we care about this and not so much that. It's also to enrich the individual and allow them to explore intellectual and indeed spiritual questions depending upon their subject. But crucially, it should believe in the idea of objective progress, of true invention, true discovery of truths to be found, of knowledge to be had that anyone can partake in. So, in a strange sense, it's not really rocket science what the environment of a university should be, and that's why they've been a relatively stable institution for almost 1,000 years now. What's obvious, however, is that it only takes a few things to be awkwardly shifted and for there to be restriction of the principles of exploring these big and enduring questions, and suddenly it becomes something very different, a madrasa of sorts, rather than a space to spread your wings intellectually.
I'm going to take this into the really right into the realm of what it means to be a teacher. There's a kind of analog, and I'm not saying it's a parallel. There's a kind of analog in what it means to be a good parent. So there are we have some parents in the room, though my wife and I have not been blessed with children. I grew up in a big family. I've got 9 younger siblings, 7 younger brothers, and 2 younger sisters. And so I grew up in this environment of having these young people whose lives mattered an immense amount to me, and thinking about what it meant to foster their realization, foster the realization of their potential. And I think every parent or older sibling knows that when it comes to how you do that well, there's 2 extremes that don't work at all. And one of them is constantly telling people what to do. You know, do this and do that, and because I'm right about this, and because this will, why doesn't it work? Well, it works because it undermines the free agency of the person themselves. And in fact, psychologists know that, even if you know truly, you have insight into this person's life, their dysfunctions, their difficulties, and so on, just telling them that and what they should do, and you may be right about this, it doesn't work because it's not theirs, right? It hasn't become theirs. That's one extreme that has to be avoided because it undermines the free agency of the individual. And you can tell where we might go with this because, You have to build communities that somehow affirm that free agency. But then on the other side, you don't simply say, well, this is a free agent. Have at it. Good luck to you then, right? I mean, you don't send your kids off into the wilderness and hope that they come back as, Thomas Jefferson or Martha Argerich. It's like, well, that's not how it works either. And so, between those two extremes, it's something like fostering an environment and bringing someone along in such a way that you enable them themselves to see and discover the things that they want to discover. And that's not doing nothing, and it's not being prescriptive. It's somehow fostering a free engagement on a trajectory that they are made or have the potential to go on. And that will be different in each person's case. The characteristics of that being non-coercive, and you might say invitational, non-coercive, are going to be the same, broadly speaking, in many contexts, educational and otherwise. But in another sense, it's always going to be particular, because you and you and you and you and all of the students are all going to be different people with different aptitudes and attitudes and abilities and so on. And the art is somehow being able to see in that person, in a kind of incipient way, what's in them looking to be realized. These are sort of general, call them principles or insights. And David, I'm wondering if you've had 20 years or so as a teacher at Cambridge or nearly, something like that?
Yeah.
Well, maybe it's 15 or so, but
maybe.
It's more than a decade you've been teaching. Well over a decade at the University of Cambridge. I know from reputation that you're a damn good teacher. And so I'd like to have you reflect a bit, perhaps in your own life, your great teachers you've seen at this great university, and as a teacher, in regard to your students. How does one do teaching well?
Well, it's certainly a balance between the external and the internal. There's no question that the most profound part of a university education should be internal growth and enlightenment within the individual. But it can't just be that. And if we look at the words we use for a university degree, where you get grades and you are on a course, all three of those words are from the same metaphor of a journey. You're going somewhere, and those around you have a sense of the relative route you are meant to take. And it's vital that those external guide rails are there. The tradition of scholarship, the idea of a curriculum, secondary reading that is worth your time, and secondary reading that simply is not. So whatever's happening individually in your own enrichment, a good teacher has confidence in his or her discipline. Again, such an important word, the idea that there is a set of scholarly skills, whatever your discipline, that will train you to get along that journey. You are going somewhere which other people can appraise, and you can do it better or you can do it worse. Value judgments can be made on your educational journey, and indeed should be made. So in terms of being a good teacher, and it's very kind of you to say I am, but I feel the best I can do is to provide scope for the bright, the curious young people of our world who are just as curious and just as keen for knowledge and transformation as ever, to have the resources and the freedom to pursue that journey. And at times you have to pick them up. At times you have to show them that their assumptions are actually mistaken, but that it's an exciting thing to challenge those assumptions and rediscover or discover new ones on which to build. So it's constructive, if occasionally obstructive and destructive, given where people may or may not have got intellectually. But there needs to be a confidence in the purpose of the university. And it can't be instrumentalized. It can't be made into an institution that does X and Y for you so you can go and do A and B in the world. And one of the objections I have with a sort of current critique from the political left about our universities is they say, oh, well, in the neoliberal framework, they've just been turned into factories to create workers. And I agree that that is not the place a university should be going. But those self-same people, in the next breath, want to instrumentalize the education for external social activism, to go out and do ABC in the world. And that's equally instrumental. It just takes us to an equally sad and depressing place in terms of what university education should be. So creating freedom within a clear sense of progress, somewhere is really all that needs to happen. And you need to defend your undergraduates and your graduates when they come into disagreement. There's nothing wrong to have arguments, even impassioned arguments, so long as the confidence in evidence and indeed truth endures.
Yeah, and I think that brings up something very, very fundamental about how good teaching and real conversations happen. It really comes down to how it's essential they not be coercive. And I think, sometimes people ask me, well, what are your students going to go on to do at Ralston College? Like, what do you, sometimes as if we have a program and we're trying to make, 3 engineers and 3 political figures and 2 lawyers and a couple of classicists. And though, of course, we have the highest hopes for our students and the ways in which their unique abilities and great potential will be realized in the world, there's a sense in which that to be an educator is not to presume what you might say the end or the particular outcome of this person's studies will be. And I think that this redounds into the classroom in a day-to-day level, because if it's taken to be a foregone conclusion where this argument needs to go, well, it's not free. It's not a free unfolding. It's already violated, you might say, the fundamental terms that enable things to come about in their highest and best form. And I think that we're living in a time in which there's, a lot of noise online and various kinds of partisan and ideological and activist and various other kinds of kind of threats and perceived coercions. And it seems to me that one of the terrible outcomes of that is that it actually just doesn't give the space for real thinking to take place, for what we would all recognize as a real conversation to unfold. And the exciting thing about a real conversation is that you actually don't know where it's going. I mean, one of my favorite things is to sit around with friends around dinner for 5 or 6 hours and let a conversation, you have no idea at the beginning of that night where it's going to be at the end. You only know that these are great interlocutors with whom you can sort of traverse wonderful territories. And as you traverse them, they open up and you discover things. You didn't know that was there. And gosh, and at the end of it, this is the beautiful thing about real conversation and really seeking the truth. Is that, yes, you know something. We all know things that are true. We all have sense. But there's all this that you don't know. And even within what you know, there's things you don't know. Or you thought it was this, but it's a little different than that. And so it's the way in which, I think you've said this so beautifully, the way in which there's a kind of invitation to adventure in learning of any kind. Well, with that said, I think what we'll do, John, why don't you come up and join us here and we move over here, David, and we'll maybe seat your seat back a bit so you can. This is the great John Vervaeke, who I think needs no introduction. He's been a guide in precisely the way I've been trying to describe for so many people, inviting them into a kind of adventure of seeking the truth, discovering rich meaning in their lives. And so we're John, thank you so much for coming. It's great to have you. John and I gotten to know each other a little bit. He was at Ralston College last year for a lecture, and then we've spent some time talking about the Gospels recently with our Chancellor Jordan Peterson at the Daily Wire. And so I want to give you a chance to share some thoughts here, John, and then what we're hoping is that any other comments, as it were, from the floor, comments, questions, reflections, critiques, radical opposition, whatever is in the mix would be great. Just to grab a mic and so we can catch you for the recording. So John, of course, has been teaching at the University of Toronto for several decades. So you two are coming at this with a deep bench of experience in pedagogical environments, but you've also, at a meta level, been thinking about cognition and how that takes place in your research online and elsewhere. So what do you think?
So first of all, I think what you and David have been talking about is very dear and to me, close to my heart. as many of you perhaps know, I do a lot of work on what I call the meaning crisis, which is the fact that people are finding it increasingly difficult to find what's called meaning in life, a sense of connectedness to themselves, to other people, to the world. And part of that has to do with the eclipse of a shared religious framework. I'm not here advocating for Christianity, but that's part of the historical circumstances. Now, in that loss of that shared framework, we lost two things. And I'm going to get to a point that I think was running between both of you, which is there's been an implicit shift in the underlying normativity of education. And I think that implicit shift bespeaks a fundamental shift that's happening within the culture at large. I think there's been a fundamental reduction of logos to logic, and then there's been a fundamental reduction of agape, person-making love, the love that makes people into desire. And then the logic becomes instrumentalized for the satisfaction of desire, and then you get Nietzsche's will to power. That's basically, sorry, that was like that's very bold, right? So I can unpack all of that in argument, but that's the gist of. And I think what we're losing is, of course, the normativity of power. It can't stand because, well, what do you mean by power? Well, to exert control over reality. Well, then you have to have some grasp over reality. You have to have some knowledge of yourself. You have to have some knowledge of other people such that you can manipulate, blah, 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 blah. And it collapses. It's not a viable thing. So it tells you that it's actually been uprooted. It's a degradation and also an uprooting of what it was ultimately depended on and grounded it. And these are these two notions of logos and love. So, for example, reason. We have shifted to a model of reason in which the individual reasoner is inside their mind engaging in a monologue. And we think that's what it is to reason, and that is not what it is to reason at all. In fact, the cognitive science is showing that reason is inherently dialogical in nature. The best way, so you take a standard reasoning task that people do very poorly on, even if they're university educated. It's called the Weights and Selection task. I won't go into the detail, but you can do this with many kinds of experiments. You run it with an individual, and 10% of the population gets it right. Reliably, no matter what their education, their ideology. Then you take that same experiment, replace it with 4 people, and they talk to each other. They have to talk in a certain way. If there's zero-sum game competition, there's no change. But if they talk dialogically, which is, you will be my best source of self-correction, and I will be your best source of self-correction, then the success rate goes from 10% to 82%.
Wow.
We evolved to reason dialogically, which means our fundamental kind of reasoning isn't the logical marshaling of propositions. It is about being reasonable with each other. And think about we even have this distinction. Think about in law, we talk about the reasonable person. We don't mean a person who can run a syllogism. We mean somebody who in a situation takes the correct perspective on it, that summons their agency so they know what they are responsible to and for in that situation. That's what it is to be a reasonable result. You see how that's inherently dialogically oriented? We've lost that. Now, that notion of reasonableness is ratio. Things are bound into a proper proportioning. And what I'm trying to show you is I can't properly proportion my perspective on the world without other perspectives. The two core things for being rational are ability to reflect on yourself. And then, you know how we do this? We do it agapically. You, as a child, internalize the perspectives of your parents and your peers, and you imitate that until you get to a point where you can do it on your own. That's how you get that reflective ability that is central to being rational. It is inherently dialogical in nature. Second, defining feature of rationality is you care more about the process than the product. This is how you can reliably, experimentally determine how rational people are. Give them a proposition they really like or they really hate, you ahead of time, and then give them a bad argument that leads them to the conclusion they like, or a poor argument that leads to the conclusion they like. Ask them to evaluate the argument. 80% of people will choose based on their pre-commitment to the proposition, the conclusion. Rational people are the people who can stand back and say, wait, I'm prone to self-deception. I should pay a lot of attention to the process for its own sake. I should never be focused on the quality of outcome, for example. Because if I over-focus on the product and neglect paying attention to the process, I undermine the central commitment of being reasonable, which is to, again, take responsibility for my proclivity to self-deception and take responsibility for my dialogical commitment to the person-making of other individuals, because I am dependent on them for making my personhood. And we have lost logos and agape, because the Christian tradition, I'm not a Christian, I'm not advocating for Christianity, the Christian tradition was the sanctification of logos and agape. There's lots of criticisms of the Christian tradition, but what it does is it foregrounds this. So like with Christopher Mastropietro, Taylor Barrett, Rick Rapetti, at the Vervaeke Foundation, we have created a practice called dialectic into dialogos that is about trying to create exactly this reasonable agapic framework where people get caught up in a logos that takes on a life of its own, like Stephen was talking about in that conversation. And what they're talking about is virtue. And they're not trying to be right. We tell them the goal is not to be right. The goal is for everybody to get to a place they couldn't have got to on their own, so that they come into a right relationship with the virtue. And this is a deeply transformative practice. We have been doing this now for 2 or 3 years? We've run a lot of this. We have intensive courses, workshops, and the response we get from people is overwhelming. The response is, this is a form of intimacy I've always been looking for, but I didn't know. And thank you. And how do I do this more? And I never understood virtues this way. I feel now like I have a personal relationship and responsibility to the cultivation of virtue. So what this is I'm trying to make an argument here that what is lost, right? And that the reason why this practice is so successful is precisely because people are still hungering for this, because we are not grounded in power, we are grounded in logos and love.
Gosh, it's hard to follow that. It's hard to follow that. One of the things that this so beautifully connects to is, what are the terms of the discussion? We hear a lot about freedom of speech in the United States, rightly so. It's enshrined in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, absolutely fundamental right in any kind of free society. And yet, we often hear about freedom of speech from only one angle, which is that, you have to be free to say things. And of course, it's a hill I will die on, to be clear. How can you, for example, discover that, the world is not flat if you're not allowed to say, maybe it isn't? You have got to challenge orthodoxy and so on. But it seems to me that that's only, at best, half of what a real discourse or dialogue of the kind that John, that you're so beautifully describing. And the other side, maybe the more important side actually, is in what you yourself are bringing in terms of good faith to what you don't yet know. And so there's a sense in which, I say at Ralston College, that the community can only, there's no better index as to whether it's a community of genuine freedom of inquiry other than whether I, and each of us as I's, am known positively to be someone who welcomes and is hungry for correction, for knowing where I'm wrong, for knowing better what I don't yet understand. Because it seems to me that it's very hard to have a productive logos and love characterized conversation if it's not already in the sense that, we're willing each other's good in precisely that way. And you might say that there's a trust that depends upon, which is why, I think it's the case that so many of these, whether online exchanges or whatever, go nowhere because they're from the beginning not rooted in any kind of relationality in which you can say, okay, I can let my guard down here and have a conversation about something that really matters to me. David, any further thoughts before we open it up here?
No, I think fundamentally what we're all saying is that believing in the good faith of your interlocutor and by virtue of that, believing that conversations will be mutually advantageous, even if you end up in a place you don't know where you're going, have to be at the heart of any serious educative process. And if you view others in that environment with bad faith, the game is over. It's simply not going to be a dialogical place for instruction. We need that trust. So.
Okay, 2 questions here. We'll start your hand first. Please, and if you'd like, introduce yourselves and make sure you've got a mic. And yes, and you are?
My name is Scott.
Of course, we know each other.
I'm a psychologist. In good faith, I'd like to challenge you.
Good.
And tell you why. Something I think a little more nuance here could add something to the conversation. You made a statement. You said, as every psychologist knows, people don't like to be told what to think. As a psychologist, I want to say that as every psychologist knows, individual differences abound. And a lot of people do like to be told what to think. I think you're projecting.
That may be true.
Every psychologist knows that we do a lot of projection based on our own individual differences. As a professor at Columbia University, I see first and foremost, I have a front row seat with popcorn to the shit show that's going on at the moment. And I will say that after talking to a lot of protesters and everything, I've realized that what we've done, especially I'm a professor at Barnard College in particular, we're selecting for activists. It needs to be said. There's been a shift in the last 5-6 years in terms of admission criterion. So now what we're doing is we're looking and rewarding students in their high school applicants. We're prioritizing and moving to the front of the line, for better or for worse. I just want to state a real fact of what I am seeing and witnessing. We're moving to the front of the line, not those who put in their personal statement, I value scholarly discourse and good faith acting. Those actually have moved to the bottom of the line. If they don't have any disadvantages, they're moved, so if you have some sort of disadvantage, it's now become a competition for who has had the greatest sort of victimhood. I'm actually writing a whole book about this right now, so it's just right on my mind. So we're rewarding this sort of competitive victimhood environment. And I think that's selecting for those who actually do want to be told and given a meaning. I would phrase it differently in the way I would phrase it as he would. They want to be given a meaning. Not everyone's route to meaning is your route to meaning, which is these values of truth, veritas. So I just want to clarify their individual differences in routes to meaning, and I think we're selecting for a particular route. I hope that makes sense and added to the conversation.
No, I think that's extremely helpful, Scott. Thank you. And I would I'd entirely accept and affirm that, while also saying that diversity of human beings being different means that different environments are going to help realize the particular character of people. And not everyone's made for university, for example, and far too many people are in fact going. University is not a good place for someone who just wants to be told what to do. That's not what it's for. I would also want to affirm nonetheless that I think there is a free agency that is important in a kind of nearly, if not universal way in human beings. That doesn't mean that everyone's made for, reading Descartes' Meditations or something like that, but that some choosing of with whom they will associate and how they will live, something in that. But I entirely take the point. Colin, I think you had a comment or reflection.
Yeah. So my name is Colin Wright. I'm an evolutionary biologist. One thing that stood out that you're all saying has to do with sort of the active nature of creating an environment, of fostering it. You use the word like cultivating. And I just think that is so important, because it's not so much that you have a lot of institutions that'll pay sort of the lip service to free speech, but they don't take active steps into creating an environment where when you're speaking into that environment, it's being met with skepticism of your motivations, trying to look behind the mask. Why are they really saying? What's their agenda that they're pushing? And so you get this claim that I've been met with a lot when I was in academia of, you have the freedom to express yourself and the freedom of speech, but you don't have the freedom from consequences for your ideas. But we need to have the environments right. where there actually aren't consequences for voicing opinions that are that you're genuinely voicing into it. I mean, there's not much difference between the freedom of speech but no freedom from consequences from sort of like the Maoist 100 Flowers campaign. It's go ahead and speak your mind, but if you happen to overstep, you're going out back. So the active fostering of these environments, this cultivating environments where you're not skeptical and trying to look at the motivations and you're not looking to tear people down, that is really the most important aspect of the entire the environment. And that's what the universities aren't doing. They're not actually fostering these environments. They're just paying lip service to them.
Yeah, so very well said. It seems to be one of the things we see in the United States, where we have very strong protections publicly of freedom of speech with the First Amendment, which would be, in fact, very difficult to overturn. There's no significant political risk to the First Amendment. It's hard to amend the Constitution legally, politically, according to the Constitution itself in the United States. But what we see is that protection of freedom of speech, though no doubt a necessary condition for an environment of freedom of speech, is not anything like a sufficient condition, because we're living in a time in which precisely what you say is happening both on campus and off. That it's not actually anything like a sufficient a place. I think in the end, the argument for freedom of speech is something like, imagine you are about to cross a busy street. Here we are in greater New York City. We're in Brooklyn right now today. And it's a busy street. You got your headphones on, you're distracted, something happening in your day, and you're about to walk into traffic, right in front of a bus, and someone says, "Colin, stop, stop, stop." In some sense, to me, that's what freedom of speech is. It's just our attempt to share with each other the things we think we know about the world for each other's benefit. And it takes an environment in which you can hear, but also say the things that need to be said in order for that to happen. It seems to me it's the environmental side of this that we're failing at, perhaps more than any other one. Because without that, it just doesn't happen. And I'm going to take these as close as I can to the order. But what I feel you want to add something to that. And then over, Africa, did you have a comment? No, you did. Over to yes.
Okay,
Please,
I have
you're
two
next.
things to add to what Colin was saying. It's the importance of speaking from our hearts without shame and being open about that. And it's from our hearts, right? So then to make the world a better place. But what I was going to highlight, if I think about education and I go back, and I think all of us probably at some point had a fabulous teacher or three or whatever that you always remember. And what is it you remember about them? And what I remember about them is that they helped me become grounded in my own ability to access my own wisdom. So that's what they gave me. And it was sometimes in the conversation with the teacher that they learned something from me. And that was so exciting for me to have that dialogue and have them learn as we learn together. So, teachers do so much. Now, one more thing, K-12. We know right now in North America that teachers think that they're all activist teachers. They're all supposed to teach the kids to be activists. Let's say your university, and it does great work, you're going to get stuck with some of these kids. So how do you unindoctrinate them from what they've come so that they get indoctrinated into learning and the love of learning?
Beautifully said. I think there's a comment over here.
Yeah.
And John and David, jump in anytime, obviously.
Well, I think that's a good question.
Okay. Just before, go ahead.
I mean, I think, and I want to pick up on what Scott said. And by the way, it's good to see you, Scott.
So good to see you too.
Yeah. What you just said, I think, was really important. I think we've also lost a deeper sense of education to draw out. And I think commensurate with the idea of power and indoctrination is like, what I'm doing is I'm transmitting to you, and you are supposed to receive. And I think that in order to recover that notion of education, we have to get back to, and this is, this is what I preach to Scott's kid, the notion of this meaning, this connectedness. And the thing about it is that's inherently dialogical. It's inherently relational. It's neither, and Stephen was trying to get between these two extremes. It's neither the empiricist position that the world just writes itself on me and I just take it in, right? Which is kind of behind some of the versions of indoctrination we're criticizing it. But there's also the opposite difficulty, which I also encounter as a teacher, which is the romantic expressivism. The world is a blank canvas. It has no inherent structure, and my job is to express myself upon it. And neither one of those are education. Neither one of those are education. Education is inherently dialogical, that the world and you and other people, meaning is a co-created thing. It's in that sense, it's cooperative in a very deep sense. And I think So I'm saying, I think what you're pointing to is we've also lost the deeper sense of how education actually unfolds and takes place. I hope that lands with you.
Come to a question over here.
Yeah, Stephen, thanks for inviting me yesterday. I met Stephen yesterday. My name is Andrew Coughlin. I live in Washington, D.C. I'm an attorney there. I'm an adjunct professor at an HBCU law school down there. And I was actually telling David about this. It's an incident, and my question is for David and John. How would you have handled this situation? So I was teaching, and I told an anecdote. Jason and I are from Milwaukee. Milwaukee's a very segregated city. And this student of mine, she was also from Milwaukee. I told an anecdote about me getting pulled over in high school in my dad's car. And the police officers were not very nice to me about it. And we're living in a predominantly white neighborhood. I'm half Thai, half Irish American. My dad's white. And they were hassling me about it. And she said, racist. I was like, it's an interesting accusation. Maybe she was adamant as they were treating the way that they were treating you was inherently racist. So then I just let it lie. The next week I came back. I thought maybe we can have a lesson on this. So I brought in the elements of 1983 civil rights violation, where typically if you're going to prosecute a police officer civilly, this is what you're going to do. And I brought in the elements, and the rest of the class participated because I was like, all right, let's bring it back to the law here. If this is your accusation, which is a very serious accusation, then let's test your limits here. And she refused to participate. How would you have handled that differently?
No, I mean, I'm no legal expert, of course. I think you're bringing it back to first principles and taking it to a legal, argument-based, evidence-led, open discussion is exactly how to handle it. And that's why, I feel this language we used to hear until so recently, but not so much very recently, about microaggressions, speech code violations of individuals feeling that they are somehow personally offended by the nature of where an intellectual discussion has gone, are so detrimental to the good faith, open discussion that is meant to be at the heart of what we do. So I'm not sure how in your institution you should have responded once she refused to participate, but thancfully it's not exactly a scenario I've been in so extreme a form.
Oh, I was reported to HR.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, gosh.
That's incredible.
I had all of my classes recorded. That was my request when I signed on to become a professor.
Right.
So we just watched the footage back. I filled out a report, and nothing ever came of it. John, would you have handled it differently?
I agree with David. I think you're doing the right thing. Sometimes what I do is I try to get people, the hallmark of rationality is I try to say, are you objecting to the outcome? So I'll go off and I'll talk about the difference between the process and the product, and how, and everybody, when you do it in this sort of abstract over here, everybody gets the principle. Oh yeah, of course. If we're going to persuade each other, we have to pay attention to the argument, not just the result. And you say, okay, so now, are you criticizing you don't like the result, or you think there's something wrong with the process? Are there self-corrective mechanisms in the process, and can we still use them? Of course, they're going to break down in individual cases because we're human beings. That's why we have humans in the system to make judgment. But do you think, and if you say, well, here's evidence that the process is actually still working self-correctively. We catch these people when we do this. You can do this. You can do this. Isn't that what you want? And so I try to separate people to try and break them from, no, this is the way the world has to be. It's a really naive just world hypothesis. It's often behind it. I have this vision of this is the way this world is going to be. Do you? Do you realize how complex the world is? Do you realize how there's inevitable trade-offs in everything you're doing? Do you realize how complex human beings are? And I try to get people to shift to that. That doesn't mean I'm always successful. There's just some people that are not prepared for whatever reason in their background. It could be trauma, which I acknowledge. It could be they have an idiosyncratic attachment. I don't know. But I found that when I do that, there's a lot of people that might not have shifted will shift. they'll go, oh, there's actually a process for dealing with this. Yeah, there is. And do you think it's working? Like, what do you think we should, maybe it's not. That's an empirical question, isn't it? Let's take a look at the information. Do we agree that these are impartial sources? Yeah. Oh, look, it looks like the process is working. The self-correction is working. That will usually ameliorate people. If you get people to pay attention, so the feeling of like the knowledge illusion is people confuse having access to a proposition with knowing how it works. Like, you can do this with something really powerful. You ask somebody, do you know how a toilet works? Yeah. Draw a diagram, explain to me how a toilet works. And that, oh shit, I don't know how a toilet works. That's right. You have to do the same thing with this. So this is what the research shows. If you get people to talk about what they value, they'll dig in. And you say, well, forget. Like what you think the outcome, what's the process and how should we fix it? And what people will do is they'll move towards consensus reliably.
Now, we're going to wrap up in a moment, but one last question. David.
Thank you. There's certain universities, schools that have traditions or known that, with certain political valences. The Chicago School, Yale Law School, Berkeley. Is having such a tradition where you can not predict, but where there's, if someone is a product of this institution, they may, have this orientation or someone. Is that, in your view, a failure of the type of education without indoctrination? Is it when would it be legitimate, and when, how would you think about those outcomes?
From my perspective, I'd say two things. I think there's a legitimate distinction between the public university and the private university. The public university, by virtue of its funding, has a duty to the state not to be political in any given direction. A private institution, by contrast, could be political, and actually having a marketplace of ideas within those realms is no bad thing, so long as that institution acknowledges that particular political or ideological leaning, and within it allows free inquiry and genuine challenging of its assumptions. I think so long as that happens, having these different leanings is perfectly okay and would not classify as indoctrination in the way that I outlined at the start.
I always think the best conversations are those that open up more threads than they're able to close down, and I hope that's been true today. Thank you all for joining us for this brief hour. Great conversations are often stretched over hours, but let's consider this the beginning of many conversations between us and indeed on this podcast. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, David and John.
Thank you, Stephen.